Most lifters are training for core stability the exact wrong way. If your core stability or core training routine is just bodyweight planks, bird dogs, and dead bugs, you may be getting better at those exercises, but that's really not going to transfer over to heavy squats, deadlifts, and cleans unless they actually require a high level of core stability. So let me show you what actually builds a stronger, more stable core for the heavy lifting that you want to be doing. In this video, we're going to cover four main things. Those are: what is core stability, how is it usually trained by most lifters, the case for dynamic exercises, and how to actually program and progress your core stability training. And if you want a free 12-week core training program that takes what I'm teaching in this video and actually lays it out in a full program for you, you can click the link in the description below. Most lifters think that core stability is the ability of your core muscles to keep your spine completely rigid and unmoving and in a neutral spine position during all tasks. But really, true core stability is about not only preventing and resisting motion, but also controlling it as well. So being able to keep your spine rigid and unmoving during squats or deadlifts, being able to effectively control dynamic tasks like crunches, and also being able to effectively control spine motion during high velocity tasks like pitching are all examples of core stability. There are two main things that actually determine your core stability. Those are: one, your coordination for that given task. So if you're going to squat and you want to keep your spine rigid and unmoving, the ability of your body to coordinate the muscle contractions and actions of the core muscles to keep that spine as neutral as possible is one part of the equation. The other part that not a lot of people either seem to realize or seem to think about is how strong your core muscles are, or what their force production capabilities are. Because at the end of the day, you could have great coordination and you could have the skill of bracing effectively during your lifts and being able to keep that neutral spine position. But if you're training with loads that far exceed the strength of your core muscles or the force production capabilities of your core muscles, it doesn't matter how coordinated you are, your core muscles are not going to be able to produce the amount of force needed to effectively control your spine motion during that activity. Most lifters attempt to train or improve the core stability through low-level bodyweight isometric exercises like planks, bird dogs, dead bugs, and pull-off holds. And while these are very useful exercises and they can help improve your core stability in the beginning and improve your core strength in the beginning, they are pretty low level. Their overall force production demands are relatively low, and they're only going to take you so far. I've worked with plenty of lifters who have been given these exercises from other physical therapists or doctors or coaches, and they do them for weeks or months or sometimes even years without really any progression. They do the same bodyweight resistance for the same number of sets and reps and the same time duration of the holds. And they do this thinking that they're working on their core stability and improving the performance of the core, when in reality, they may have gotten a little bit of benefit in the beginning, but once they've had those first little bit of adaptations in core stability and core strength from those first few bouts of exercise, that level of training is no longer useful, and really it's just wasting time without giving you any added benefit. For most lifters, these types of drills have two kind of main benefits or main uses. The first is just teaching the overall coordination of core stability and how to keep your core rigid and unmoving, which can transfer over to barbell lifting. The other is if you're either very detrained or you're dealing with back pain. These low-level isometrics have overall kind of low forces and low amounts of stress on the back when they're doing them. And because of that, they tend to be tolerated very well by lifters who have back pain. They're a great entry point to loading the spine and getting some exercise in and helping to alleviate that pain in the short term and build up a little bit of confidence. The issue is when you don't progress past these exercises, you just end up doing them forever without getting that added benefit and just wasting a bunch of training time. Doing these exercises for weeks or months or even years without any progression and expecting to still see improvements in core stability or core strength is kind of like only ever loading 135 on the bar and only ever squatting with that weight and that intensity for weeks, months, or years, and expecting that to equal a 315-pound squat. You just don't have that actual progression that forces your core to get stronger and build up that stability over time that will get you to the goals that you have. And if you want to keep doing these exercises in a way that continues to give you benefits, then you need to find a way to increase the intensity over time. And the best way to do that is with external loading. So you can add weight on top of your hips or your low backs during planks. You can add some form of resistance to dead bugs and bird dogs. The issue is when it comes to the logistics of doing this. Adding enough weight onto planks and different low-level, typical kind of core stability exercises does come with some logistical issues. It can be hard to get those weights into place, to set them on your back or your hips, to actually do the weighted planks at an intensity level that's actually going to continue to drive strength improvements and adaptations. So because of that, the overall loadability and progressibility of these exercises is somewhat limited. So when I'm working with my clients, I often have them start with some of these drills and progress the volume and the intensity over time as we can. But then really, once we get past those initial kind of training stages, we then typically shift to dynamic exercises like different crunch variations, back extension variations, and side bends, because these have a couple of really big benefits or big pros compared to those more traditional core stability exercises. Just due to the nature of these exercises, they tend to be a lot more loadable, they're a lot easier to progress. I find them a lot more fun to train, and you also get the added benefit of training your spine in a non-neutral position, which is going to have a lot of carryover to your strength and confidence and capacity, not only in the gym, but in your daily life as well. Because when you're training hard, if you're taking a set of like a maximal weight or maximal intensity, or you're taking a sub-maximal set close to or to failure, there are probably going to be times where you get out of position a little bit, you have a little bit of technique breakdown, and you're going to find yourself not in a neutral spine position. And if you never train for that in a systematic and progressive manner, then when you do find yourself in that position, it basically is a really big change or a big stressor that your body isn't used to. And that's when pain and injuries and flare-ups are much more likely to happen. And this is the exact situation that my client Dylan found himself in. He had been dealing with back pain for a long time. He had gone through the traditional kind of PT route, and he was given all the typical kind of cookie cutter core stability exercises. He was given a lot of planks and bird dogs and dead bugs and just said to do those forever and ever. And he saw a little bit of progress in the beginning, but eventually found that he was in a spot where he wasn't making continued progress anymore. That progress they had in the beginning wasn't carrying over to lifting, and he had a really hard time getting back into lifting because his back still felt really weak, his core still felt very unstable, and he didn't feel like he could actually keep up with the type of training that he wanted to be doing. So when we started working together, we started with some of these lower level core stability drills, but we also made sure to add intensity, add external loading as that initial strength built up, and then switch to dynamic exercises over time so that we could continue to challenge his core and his core muscle strength and actually build it up in a way that really did transfer over to heavy lifting. And ever since doing that, he's found that his back feels a lot more strong, he feels a lot more stable, he's gotten back to heavy squatting and deadlifting and cleans, and he's just in a much better spot because he has done the training that prepared him to get to the type of lifting that he actually wanted to be doing. So when it comes to core training, there are basically 4 planes of motion or types of movement that you can train. Those are flexion, extension, rotation, and side bending. And you can train all of these either isometrically or dynamically. And we're gonna cover 1 or 2 exercises for each and kind of how you can progress from isometric to dynamic type motions. So when we're talking about flexion, if we're talking about this from an isometric standpoint, this would be anti-extension. So using your abs to prevent you from bending backwards. And if we're talking about it from a dynamic standpoint, then it would just be flexion, which is rounding your spine forwards. The typical kind of isometric exercise for this would be planks and dead bugs. And dynamic variations for this would be any sort of resisted or loaded crunch variation. When it comes to extension, we're talking about the low back muscles themselves. So if we're talking isometrically, we usually call this anti-flexion, so preventing you from running forward. And if we're talking about this dynamically, then we just call it extension, which is bending backwards. The typical isometric drills for this type of movement are things like reverse planks and bird dogs. If we want to progress to dynamic exercises, a couple of my favorites are either GHD or 45-degree back extensions, where the pad is actually placed higher up, kind of on your lower abdomen. So it actually gives you a pivot point to flex and extend your spine around. And you can also do Jefferson curls if you want to do this from a more standing perspective and incorporate a little bit more posterior chain as well. For side bending, the most common isometric drill is either a side plank or a suitcase hold, where you're just holding some sort of dumbbell or kettlebell or external resistance and preventing your spine from bending towards that side. And for dynamic exercises, you can do things like a GHD or 45-degree side bend, or you can do a standing side bend, also holding a dumbbell, kettlebell, barbell, whatever implement allows you to load it up heavily enough. For rotation work, the typical isometric exercise is a pow-off hold, where you're taking a band or a cable, you're standing so that it's perpendicular to your body. You start with it near your chest, and then you just press away from your chest and try to hold it there without letting it rotate you back to that anchor point. And if we want to progress to a dynamic exercise, we can do things like a half kneeling rotation, half kneeling chop or lift, or even a bent over standing rotation. Now, the big question that a lot of lifters have is, how do you actually program and progress this in a practical standpoint? So I take it one of two ways. For my clients who are either very detrained, haven't lifted for a while because they have been dealing with some sort of injury or they just haven't been able to train, then I will sometimes start with isometric work. But if they're not injured, I do prefer lower intensity, lower volume dynamic exercise because I think that they are just have a better runway to progress over time, so it makes sense to start there. If I'm working with somebody who does have back pain, then very often I will start them with isometric exercises because they are tolerated a lot better. They're a lot less likely to cause a flare-up in pain or kind of like a re-injury, and it can be a lot less nerve-wracking for my clients to start with this type of exercise compared to some sort of crunch or back extension or side bending variation. So for starting with isometrics, I'll usually pick one movement for each of these four kind of main movement patterns or positions and start that with lower volume and lower intensity isometric holds. I might start them with 2 to 3 sets of 10 to 20 second holds with just their body weight, and then progress that duration of the hold up to about 45 seconds to a minute over time as pain subsides, endurance and performance improves, and they're having more confidence. And then once they can hit that 45 to 60 second mark, I'll then start to add a little bit of external resistance through either a plate or a dumbbell or a kettlebell and bring the time of the hold back down to the lower end and kind of work back up in a stepwise manner. Once we get to the point where they're handling decent loads for the isometric work and it's starting to get a little bit challenging from a logistical or setup perspective, that's when I'll then progress them to more of the dynamic exercises. If I'm working with a client who's never really done a lot of dynamic core training before, then I'll usually start them with lower volumes and lower intensity efforts so that they can start to kind of dip their toes into the water of this type of training, but in a way that doesn't kind of overshoot what their body is capable of, nor cause them a lot of stress and anxiety about the fact that they are doing dynamic core exercises now. So I might just choose one exercise per movement pattern, kind of spread that throughout the week, and start them off with just 1 or 2 sets per exercise with lighter loads and higher rep sets, typically in like the 12 to 15 rep range. And then as we repeat that type of training over the course of a couple weeks, I'll gradually increase the volume and the intensity to match what their end goals are. So if I'm working with a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter whose sport is maximal singles, so they have very high force or strength production demands, then I will gradually work their dynamic core training to higher and higher loads and lower rep per set targets, even in the 3 to 5, 3 to 6 rep range sometimes. And if I'm working with somebody like a CrossFit athlete who has much more of a variety of demands in their training, I like to mix in a little bit of higher rep, more endurance focused efforts, but at high internal intensities, so they're taking them to or close to failure. And we mix that with some really high load, low rep training to give them a broad base of core performance and core strength so that they will be prepared to handle the demands of whatever type of training their workouts entail. And remember, if you want to see how this is actually built out into a progressive program, you can download that free 12-week program in the description below. So just to recap, most lifters train core stability completely the wrong way because that's what they've been told to do by other physical therapists, chiros, or doctors who don't actually really understand training. Most lifters train this with low-level stability drills, which work on that coordination aspect of core stability, but they really neglect the strength and force production side of the equation, which is where this type of dynamic training and overall just progressive core training really comes in handy. And if you're dealing with a pain or an injury that's been affecting your training and you want to overcome it and confidently get back to the heavy lifting that you love, then click this video that shows you exactly how our program works so you can see if it's the right thing for you.